So real quick, a word about cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. Maybe 5 years ago, cross-site scripting was all about popping cookies and alert boxes. It's much worse now. I actually was thinking about putting together a presentation about the JavaScript language and what about it makes it very interesting. It's a very simple scripting language, but it has very complicated string manipulation functions in terms of regexes. It can do remoting. You can actually have make service calls and almost have like a master-slave relationship. It can make HTTP requests using AJAX or some of the other DOM things like image tags and iframes. Its speed was kind of a problem today, but I mean, y'all have 2 gigahertz machines, right? Because you got to run Word, so I mean, speed isn't really a problem. No, I'm serious. In '97, your average person had a P150, and if they were just browsing the internet, you know, that's probably what my mom had at the time. And you know, do you remember how slow P150s were when you had 32 megs of RAM and you were running Windows 95? That was really slow. I mean, it seemed quick, but when you load up the big bloated web browser because they kept throwing stupid things like layers and all this other crap from the browser wars in there, I mean, those things were slow. But the browsers are very trimmed down. They're very quick. IE7's fast. Mozilla, Firefox, those things are fast. And the fact that, you know, you download script, the script executes almost immediately. Even though it's interpreted, it's executed really quick. The other thing that people say is cross-site scripting is very difficult to detect and create a payload for. Normally, you had to handcraft a cross-site scripting payload. I'd find a site that was vulnerable, I'd figure out what I'd want to do, and then I'd figure out what payload I wanted to use. Well, actually, back in September, I spoke out at TourCon, which is a great conference in San Diego, about cross-site scripting and using it to try to facilitate various types of, you know, phishing and identity theft. And I wrote a tool that would find cross-site scripting, and it was like a Metasploit for web apps. It would find a vulnerability and just had a big library of payloads to drop in. And so you separated the payload from the code you need to actually exploit the web browser. And it looks something like this. And I always know I'm onto a good idea when I talk to my friend Tom Cross, and he just looks at me and goes, Billy, this technology has no legitimate use. Because it means I've found something that's pretty cool, even though it probably has no legitimate use other than, you know, owning people. But I found this, I wrote a tool called Cross-Site Crafter, and no, you cannot have the source, which would find all these vulnerabilities, and it would just say, insert your cross-site scripting payload here. And I can't do a demo for you, but I had payloads for key logging, for remoting using cross-site script proxy, some other stuff, and it was just drop the payload in, owned. Now, you attach this to something like using Johnny Long's Google hacking as a front end to find sites. You do this to actually interrogate the site, find the exact vuln. It would dynamically build a string, and then we would, in fact, we actually patent this, so if y'all want to try it, we'll sue you. The dynamic building of attack string, and then just drop a payload in, and you could start owning the entire internet very, very quickly. All right. I'm going pretty quick. Is this making sense? Everyone's still in their ice cream? Good? All right, sweet. All right, so let's try to talk about some of these web application worms and viruses I keep talking about. So traditional attacks are still plentiful. Don't get me wrong. You can SQL inject and cross-site script and, you know, path truncate and all sorts of stuff to your heart content. I'm certainly not saying that those attacks aren't meaningful anymore. They are. I'm just saying now we have programs that self-replicate, automatically find and then exploit web application vulnerabilities and then use that host to find more web application vulnerabilities, exploit them, and it grows exponentially. I really kind of break this up into 2 things. In fact, when I wrote this in January, I was really solid on this terminology. And I've kind of waxed and waned over it, but when I explain it to people, it makes sense. You've got web worms, which are really malware that can propagate from one host to another. I infect google.com. From there, I'm able to infect yahoo.com. I'm actually infecting separate sites. In HD's talk, he talked about sites as being little islands. And like the MySpace attack and things like that, it infects everybody on the island, but it doesn't hop. These are things that are almost like plague victims in canoes. They destroy one island, go to the next, destroy that island, go to the next, destroy that island. We're going to hop from host to host. So these are normally language independent. Well, they can be, I meant to say host, well, you can write these things pretty much in any language. People write them in Perl, people write them in Ruby. You can actually write them in cross-site scripting, but I actually cut that so I could talk a little more about the Yammer worm. They're somewhat OS independent. A lot of times, these worms are exploiting, say, a remote code execution in you know, PHP bulletin. And the payload that I want to run is, to, delete some files and deface the site. Well, I'm going to have some RM commands and things like that if it's Unix, but I'm going to have some delete commands if it's Windows. So the payload somewhat has to be OS independent, but, you can kind of fake it. These worms run on the web server. I send an attack, I exploit some vulnerability on a web server in a web app, and then I basically get code execution on that server. And then from that server, I use that as a launching pad to detect, find other hosts, and then go to them. But the key is the code execution occurs on the server for these. It spreads by sending requests to a vulnerable target, which then executes the worm, and you continue. Payloads can be pretty much anything for these, because you've got code execution. You've already won. So web viruses, these are the things that you're thinking about right now, like myspace.com or the Yammer worm. And the reason I call them web viruses as opposed to web worms is that it's a lot like a traditional COM infector or EXE infector from back in the day. With the Sammy worm, I infected one profile on MySpace. Ray comes along, he looks at my profile, now he's infected. Just like the old COM and EXE infectors, they'd have one program, you execute it, it finds other executables, but it never really leaves the computer until somebody puts it on a floppy disk and trades Doom around the office. So with web worms, it just infects that island, it just infects that host. These are traditionally written in JavaScript. You could probably write it in Java using an applet, because Java applets can actually connect and talk back to the host. You could probably do it in Flash. Flash and Java have some interesting sandboxing technologies. I honestly haven't looked at them all that much, but Flash can actually have JavaScript embedded in it. It's got some neat ability to make HTTP requests. So, who knows? Maybe that's something to check out. These are completely OS independent because they're all running, they have something in the browser that interprets them. I got a JavaScript interpreter, I've got a Flash interpreter, a Java virtual machine. These things will run certainly for JavaScript, not so much for Flash and the Java virtual machine. But these things will run on a Linux box using Firefox. They'll run on a OpenBSD box with links, I guess, if they support JavaScript. I don't know. And the key thing here, as opposed to web app worms, which propagate from host to host, these run and run on the server. These actually run on the client's machine, and then they run from the client's machine. Simply viewing an infected page, the HTML pulls down these Flash objects or these JavaScript objects. It executes in it. Payloads can be bad. There are certain DOM restrictions. I mean, JavaScript can't access local files, nor can Flash, nor can Java unless it's signed. So even though there are these restrictions, payloads are still bad. At its very basic with JavaScript, I can steal your cookies, which everyone goes, oh, you stole my cookie. No. What cookie stealing means is I just hijacked your session. And from Yahoo's point of view, I am now you, or from Amazon's perspective, I am now you, and I am, filling your shopping cart full of porn. So that is what cookie theft is. It's session hijacking. I can keylog you. I can scrape your form values, steal username passwords. From the advanced point of view, I recommend you to go check out Cross-Site Scripting Proxy by Anton Reger. It was basically a way to make a bunch of botnets. Jeremiah gave an excellent presentation this morning about port scanning and just massive ownage, stealing browser history. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff you can do. I have a feeling next week is going to be very, very interesting when the advertisers get their hands on that and realize not only can they steal what OS and what your screen dimensions are, they can start finding out your browsing history. So how do these things propagate, right? I mean, they got to get from somewhere to somewhere. And what we're ultimately doing is we're exploiting some type of web application. We're going to send some specially crafted attack at some target, and it's going to execute code on the target or inject some type of code into the database. Maybe more exotic. I'm going to reflect user script and poison some caches. I mean, I don't really want to go into that, but there's some crazy stuff you can do to propagate these things. The key is, this is web stuff, right? It's all traveling over HTTP. I mean, if I'm sending single ticks or whatever, I mean, assuming that you don't have that SSL blinding your IDS, we should be able to detect that you're launching cross-site scripting attacks and stuff, right? I mean, they're known signatures. We should be able to find it. The problem is that detecting attacks in the application layer is actually quite difficult. First of all, you can't turn off port 80 on your firewall. I mean, you've got a web app, right? It kind of defeats the purpose if no one can talk to your web server. So right out the gate, I'm getting into the juicy center of your application or your enterprise. Port 80 is the most commonly open port behind DNS. So you can't stop it at the border. What you simply have to do is say, is traffic that's coming to me as an HTTP server, is this malicious or not? And the difficulty is how do you define delicious, or delicious? I define that as ice cream and chocolate syrup. But I define malicious as things that are not normal. And this is what most people do. They'll take a baseline of what is normal behavior and say anything that's not normal must be bad. The difficulty in this is that normal is an incredibly moving target. You know, as the day advances, the people who are using your app changes. You know, I always hear that Blizzard and Battle.net gets a massive hit when it becomes like 4 o'clock in the afternoon in Korea, because everyone goes home from school, logs on, and starts playing StarCraft and Diablo, and World of Warcraft, of course. So, you know, the types of people who are hitting your site change. And suddenly, you know, that 4 o'clock school bell and everyone hits Blizzard, that's got to look like a distributed denial of service attack. I mean, half of Korea just logged on to your servers. So, you know, these things change. How do you know what's good and what's not good? There's, my personal favorite, massive unanticipated traffic escalations. I actually gave a cool talk at ShmooCon about how to actually cause slashdotting by using SQL injection, or cross-site scripting to, you know, like anger the masses of Linux nerds. But, you know, if your site gets slashdotted, you just had 50,000 people visit your site in less than an hour. That's going to look like an attack to your IDS, because that sure as heck is not normal. So all this stuff is changing. You know, obviously Buy.com has more visitors during holiday season. I mean, normal's constantly moving, and this concept of saying malicious is everything that derivates from this little, you know, baseline we created simply doesn't work, because you spend all your time refining your baseline and rarely any time not training your web app firewall. So even normal site use can look like an attack, right? I mean, first of all, ASP.NET has this wonderful thing called view state, where basically they're pushing information to the client only so the client can replay it back to them. Are there any ASP.NET guys here? I really want to know why you did that, because I mean, you wanted to, like, it's basically saying, as a server, I don't want to deal with this, I'll just push it to the client. But, you know, by default, you guys don't sign the view state, so I can actually tamper with it, unless you actually tell me not to. But so, needless to say, every time I post back to an ASP.NET site, I'm sending kilobytes of data, you know, on the order of 4 to 8, depending on how large of a forum we've got. I may be uploading files to, you know, a forum, like avatars for, you know, the forum for my funky little image. The other fun thing is we're in the land of search engine optimization, right? We all want Google to crawl us. We're deliberately designing our sites to be friendly for something to automatically run through your entire site, find all your content, and act on your content. Well, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to run through your site, I'm going to find all your vulnerabilities, and I'm going to own you, and you actually made it easier for me to do that. Also, since we deliberately want sites to be robotic friendly, we design them this way, and we also expect one or just a few ranges of IPs to request massive amounts of traffic, because it could be a crawler, right? We don't want to disallow that. That looks normal. Large sites also expect hits from all over the globe. You know, in '97, it probably would be a little odd for Sudan to start visiting your website. And if you're Citibank, it probably still today is a little odd for people in the Sudan to be visiting you. But, you know, I can go through proxies all over the world, and it's not going to seem suspicious. We also now have international character sets. You know, I start typing kanji into a form because, you know, it looks just fine for me in Japan, but, you know, that's Unicode. How's your app going to handle that stuff? You know, suddenly I'm sending you a bunch of, you know, weird-looking, almost binary data, and anybody who's done any buffer overflows using Unicode knows it's a whole lot of fun to try to get opcodes that are actually valid Unicode. You can't tell whether it's shell script or whether it's somebody's name in Japanese. So AJAX also plays havoc with HTTP connections, because suddenly you're getting connections all the time. You're getting, you know, pings. It's always hitting web services. I mean, your entire baseline is constantly changing. The end-to-end internet is gone. Proxies and NATed IP addresses